Welcome. This is ENG 328, Study Session 2. Anglophone West African Poetry. Introduction. In this study session, you will explore how Anglophone West African poetry came into being, its history, genealogy, and how the various poets from West African descent responded to the realities in their domain. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Highlight the humanizing features of colonialism in Anglophone West Africa. 2. Establish colonialism as a major catalyst and inspiration for Anglophone West African poetry. Colonialism in Anglophone West Africa. Abiola Irele noted in the development of contemporary African literature that writing by Africans in the European languages dates back to the very beginning of active contact between languages, and the civilization which lay behind them have come to assume such a significance on this continent as to have created a new literary culture alongside the oral traditional, within which literary expression has been largely confirmed in Africa from the immemorial. 1974, ditto 481. As a result, poetry has always been in existence in the pre-literate African societies through the use of oral medium. The writing of Africans in European languages began with Africans taken captive as slaves to Europe. Among these personages we have Otoba Kugoano, Ignatius Sancho, and Olaudah Equiano. The resultant effect of the 1884-5 partitioning of Africa left Britain with West African colonies, which comprises 4 countries: Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Gambia. ITQ. True or false? Before the advent of modern African poetry, there was no poetry in Africa. Feedback. False. Even the adjective modern presupposes the existence of another which was before it. In this case, that was oral poetry. The predicament of Africans during colonialism was brought about by the material guts of the white man as embodied in the trinity of imperialism, capitalistic exploitation, and militarism. 1920, ditto 9. Aside these forces, there were the cultural ones, which were spiritually and psychologically exploitative in the sense that they tried to remold the Africans afresh. It's against the backdrop that J.H. Oldham warned when he posited that no more fatal mistake could be made than to suppose that the West alone has something to give, and the African has nothing to do but to receive. The African is not clay to be cast in to Western mold, but a living type which must develop in accordance with its own laws and express its native genius. 1955, ditto 174. Disregarding this warning, however, colonial agents, especially the Christian religion, with its education, not only imposed a strange cultural self on the African. According to P.C. Lloyd correctly put it, the missionaries introduced to the rural areas of West African faith with a new cosmology in which ancestors and native duties had no place. 1972, ditto 101. It has often been said that colonialism was not totally evil. It has been pointed out that colonialism put an end to intertribal wars and brought relative peace to the warring tribes in Africa, more so that it made nationalistic spirit possible. Without the work which the British did in opening up the towns, no national leader will have been able to gather an independence party. According to W.F. Ward, some of the defects of colonialism, the colonial masters did not do enough good work in the area of development and social services, judging from the fact that they made good profits from African tin, copper, gold, cocoa, diamond, and ivory. The British especially defaulted in giving Africans a total education because they were jittery of the fact that it might equip them for revolution and stiff opposition. As a matter of fact, those Africans who managed to obtain secondary education were not accepted by them. It is a pity that so few of the British were able to give real understanding and friendship to educated Africans and work with them as colleagues on equal terms. According to Word, the evil thing about Colobar was that it refused to distinguish between one African and another. Where it existed, no amount of education or professional qualifications or culture or home background made any difference. An African, no matter how thoroughly Europeanized, will not be allowed to live in the European area, join the European salary. The only thing that counted was his race. If the British had been able to abolish the color bar, to forget the color of a man's skin and treat him on his merits as an individual, much bitterness would have been saved. 1971 Ditto 213-6. As a matter of fact, color bar was not limited to South African alone, but had its rooted tentacles in West and East African countries. ITQ. Colonialists were credited with dousing intertribal wars and bringing peace to the colonies. Was there peace in Europe from where they came? Was Europe free of wars? If no, give examples of such wars. Feedback. The answer is no. World War I and II were triggered and raged in Europe, the land of the civilized colonialists. The Holocaust, in which Jews were distractedly depleted, about 6 million of them murdered, were initiated and instituted by Europeans. It is doubtful if anything near those ever happened in the darkest Africa. Another evil perpetrated by the British was the policy of indirect rule, which the British said meant the development of native resources for the natives by the natives under British supervision. 1971 Ditto 216. This was indeed a verbal cover-up for what did actually obtain. In the words of R. Egudu, whatever development there was benefited the colonial master more than the natives. This was done with regard to the exportation of raw materials from Africa. And in the second place, the ruling was not carried out by the natives, who were merely pawns on the chessboard of the British. The ruling, especially in southern Nigeria, was actually done by the British themselves, whose activity could not even be merely described as supervision. 1978 Ditto 8. Whatever virtue that could be attributed to colonialism, it was nevertheless one kind of huge impersonal machine moving its callous way through the African world and subjecting the Africans to anything but truly human conditions. It is in this perspective that African poets have rightly perceived it. Colonialism in West African modern poetry. The art of poetry, like all others, is a plethora symbol of variegated reaction, mental and emotional, arrayed by the zeal of ardent imaginative response to what had been, what is, and what will be. R. Egudu put it this way: the African poets who have handled colonialism as their subject are to what extent concerned with what had been, with a past that was overwhelming in it and still remains overwhelming in its undesirable intrusion into the present. What we now have before us is not just life, but a transmutation of life, and that is art. The kind of transmission or picture of the colonial forces as they operated in Anglophone West African poetry, which has been transfused by the poets, depends largely on their individual imaginative dexterity and the influences of their cultural and intellectual backgrounds. To read their poetry, therefore, is to be treated emotional exhibitions held together to varying imaginative and by central theme, colonialism, which has had a terrible impact on their life and culture. 1981, Ditto 8. In the words of Wilfred Carty, the theme of colonialism is one of the most persistent notes in African literature, and in fact in that of all newly imagined nations. It appears of historical necessity and will continue to be present in many literatures, for its effect on individuals and societies have been deeply wrenching, precipitating. 1971, Ditto 45. The images of colonialism dominated the poetry of the Anglophone West African poets. Among them we have J.P. Clark, Kofi Awoonor, Wole Soyinka, Ottobah Cugoano, Raphael Amato, and Dei Anang. The poetry of the three Anglophone writers, Soyinka, Okigbo, and Clark, according to N.J. Udeyop. The poetry of Soyinka, Okigbo, and Clark, their subject matter and development of new forms based, as we have suggested, on bending English and traditional African poetic traditions to new environment, is in the mainstream of the new poetry from African. Criticism of their poetry must at all times relate the poems to their environment and the poet's growth in it. 1990, Ditto 157. In the succeeding study sessions, we shall examine the works of some of these poets individually and bring to the fore enough significance and vivid images to constitute a synopsis of the picture of colonialism which the Anglophone West African poets, to be discussed later, expanded and developed with imaginative vigor and vision. Study session summary. We have noted that the earliest group of the Anglophone West African poets were the pioneer poets, which included Gladys Casely A. Ford, Raphael Amato, and Michael Dei Anang of Ghana, Dennis Osadibe of Nigeria. The groups were mostly people who were attracted to Western culture and became disciples of the English poetic tradition. Later on, their poetry became revolutionary and nationalistic, thereby became overwhelmed with the theme of colonialism. This is the end of study session 2. Thanks for listening.